Hi and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about social class, consumerism, and values in post-war Britain. If you've been listening recently, you'll know that I've talked a lot about this in post-war America, and conditions in the two countries are obviously quite different. In America, average American citizens in the late 1940s, early 1950s had about twice the disposable income of people in Great Britain. The great consumer boom didn't begin for the British until about 1954, and in America it had come at least half a decade earlier, if not more so, from the mid to late 1940s. And this reflects an obvious reality on the outcome of the Second World War for both countries. Britain, already a debtor country after the First World War, becomes far more indebted after the Second World War. America applies to Britain stringent economic penalties or stringent economic criteria in return for granting Britain a loan in 1945, organised by John Maynard Keynes. The British had hoped to have a grant, a gift of money at the end of the war, wildly optimistic, to be honest, and in the eyes of the Americans, completely unacceptable. The British felt that as they had done some of the fighting on their own from 1939 to 41, that they really deserved a kind of a special reward, which unfortunately rather ignored the experience of places like Poland and China during the war. So the US Congress grants Britain a loan. It is for less than the British had hoped for, and the loan comes with criteria attached. The loan involves full convertibility of the pound by 1947. And the pound is converted in 1947, or is allowed to have full convertibility, i.e. you can take as much of it out of the country as you like and convert it into other currencies as quickly as you want. It collapses, and the real age of austerity begins then. However, Britain emerges from austerity in the early 1950s, and by the early 1960s, British people, and particularly British working class people, are enjoying a standard of living unparalleled in British history. Now today I'm reading from Seaton and Cohen's Power Without Responsibility, which is the classic text on understanding British media. I think it must be now in its sort of 6th or 7th printing. But it also is a journey into British society after the war. And Seaton and Cohen write, post-war affluence was measured in consumer durables. Cars, refrigerators and washing machines made it easy to do what had always been done. Television changed people's social life and habits. Commercial television was believed to alter their aspirations and values as well. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, television was central to a debate about supposed changes in the British class structure. The growth of a mass television audience and the setting up of a commercial service were seen as agents of a revolution that was eroding class distinction and increasing social mobility. Television has more often been seen as a destructive than a creative force. In the 1950s, many regarded it as a threat to traditional ways of life, and hence to the basis of traditional political loyalties. In 1962, the Pilkington Report summed up this debate. The Director General of the BBC, Sir Hugh Carleton-Greene, later called the report the most important piece of work on the purposes of broadcasting which has appeared in this or any other country. Pilkington attempted to establish the criteria for producing and judging good broadcasting. In fact, the report was very much a product of its time and was constrained by current sociological fashions. So we live in a perhaps not roughly comparable, but slightly analogous era, that of the internet and social media, bringing about rapid and unforeseen transformations to the lives of individuals, social groups, and the society as a whole. Many of these concerns, anxieties and hopes were contained in the birth of television, particularly in Great Britain. The BBC had, from the beginnings of its radio days, had always had rather a patrician attitude towards the working classes, working class audiences. Lord Reith, the first Director General of the BBC, said he intended to give the working man slightly better than he knew that he wanted, or slightly better than he expected. And it was to educate and to inform and to some extent to entertain. In an era of both new technologies and mass democracy, it was thought that methods and techniques were needed in order to shape public thought, in order to create the kinds of thoughtful, introspective, restrained, democratic citizens who would be adverse to radical change and be immersed in and content with the traditional structures of society, and who would be prudent and restrained in an era of mass consumption and the availability of cheap credit. A lot of the debates around the proliferation of TV in the 1950s and 60s came down to the key question of what it meant to be working class. It was feared that television would actually erode the working class, and that particularly affluence would destroy the working class. Working class life had been centred around the trade union, the church, the pub, the working men's club, and the other institutions of town and city life that held working class societies, working class communities together. And it was also feared that affluence and television might destroy the Labour movement or the Labour Party. In both 1955 and 1959, there were increasing numbers of working class voters who did not wish to identify as working class any longer, who saw themselves as having aspirations of home ownership or small business ownership, who wanted to embrace some of the new opportunities that the 50s and 60s were bringing them, and saw the Conservative Party as a more natural party of the aspirant working class. This is something that's revived under Margaret Thatcher with far greater effect. But in the 50s and 60s, not only had the Conservative Party essentially agreed from 1947 onwards with the Industrial Manifesto to accept the welfare state, a commitment to full employment and broad recognition of union rights, but they had also rejected the austerity of the Labour era. The austerity of the Labour era, by and large, was unfortunately unavoidable, but it continues until 1954, so long into the premiership of Anthony Eden, Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden, and finally, after the 1955 general election, when the Conservatives win again, from 55 to 59, which sees the fall of Eden and the rise of Harold Macmillan. This is where you have this generational boom. This is where you have Harold Macmillan saying essentially, "You've never had it so good." As an interesting addendum to that quote, in which, and I paraphrase because I've got it right in front of me, it says, "Our people have never had it so good, but is this actually good for our people?" Look it up anyway. So Macmillan, a patrician Tory who had been the MP for Stockton-on-Tees during the 1930s and had served in the trenches during the First World War, was more than aware of the privations that working class people had gone through in the last half century. He, as a kind of an aristocrat and an Etonian, was far from being salt of the earth in any way, shape or form. He was really one of the last generation of great Tory grandees, and everyone who came after him, up to David Cameron, we're talking Ted Heath, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, and the various non-entities and minnows that filled in between while Tony Blair was in power. None of those were members of the aristocracy. It is only from 2010 onwards that we've invited the upper classes back to rulers with, as we now see, astonishingly terrible results. But anyway, it was assumed at the time in the 1950s that a wealthier working class would simply merge into a larger middle class. And another view was that the working class continued to exist, but prosperity had left it kind of desensitized. Mass culture and convenience and affluence and consumerism had desensitized the working class from its own interests. So capitalism had proven to be too attractive. Both of these views were fundamentally flawed. The first view was that simply improving the amount of disposable income or the living standards of a person began to erode class identity, and that's not always the case. Social mobility has all sorts of unintended, unexpected, and confusing effects on class identity. People moving from being working class to living middle class lifestyles don't necessarily abandon working class values. They remember the generation of their parents and the poverty they endured, or some wholeheartedly embrace new politics as a result of their new class interests. So sometimes you see people assimilated into a new social class and embrace new political outlooks such as conservatism, but other times not. The other view, that the working class had continued to exist but had become desensitized to the predations of capitalism, is even more contentious. A working class that was enjoying the fruits of mass culture, was enjoying a periodic upswing in global capitalism, in the cycles of global capitalism, and was enjoying really the benefits of having been on the winning side during the war, is not necessarily arguable that working class would ordinarily have been reading Karl Marx and planning a Bolshevik revolution had the television not come along. One of the things that Marx never really counted for in his writing was the idea that there would be a conservative with small or a big C working class, that the working class didn't simply act as a kind of a force of political agency throughout history, inevitably overthrowing capitalism. There are numerous working class people that agree with capitalism and rather like it. So it's interesting to note that most of these views came from middle class onlookers. Seaton and Cohen write, "The first view was particularly popular among right-wing Labour politicians," this is the assimilationist view, "who used it to justify an attempt to remove socialism from the party's constitution. The steady upgrading of the working class," wrote Anthony Crosland in his book The Future of Socialism, "both occupationally and still more in terms of political and social aspirations, renders Labour's one-class image increasingly inappropriate. It was also widely held by social scientists who invented the inelegant term embourgeoisement to describe the alleged process. As Butler and Rose wrote after the 1959 general election, it is more than ever possible to speak of the Conservatives as the country's usual majority party. The Labour Party has to face the fact that its support is being eroded by the impact of age and social change. Between 1951 and 1958, real wages rose by 20%. The proportion of manual workers who owned their own homes rose from 32% to 39% in 4 years before 1962. Between 1951 and 1964, the number of television sets rose from 1 million to 13 million. Indeed, as televisions were clearly not useful, the widespread ownership of sets merely appeared to confirm what Crosland called the pubs, pools and prostitutes view of the working class, which was seen to waste all its higher income on alcohol, tobacco, gambling and fun, if not actually women. During the same period, working class habits also changed. People went on more holidays, went to the cinema less frequently, began drinking more at home and less at pubs. As these goods and habits had previously been the prerogative of higher social classes, it was assumed that their use also entailed middle and upper class values and beliefs, which again was a naive misapprehension about the way in which values and beliefs are transmitted and changed. It's worth pausing for a moment to consider Anthony Crosland. His book, The Future of Socialism, is perhaps one of the most important books in the history of the British Labour movement. It was the book that could be said to have inspired many decades down the line Tony Blair and the architects of New Labour. The idea that the old nostrums of class, community, of the working man's club and the trade union, that these were not the things that socialism in Britain was built of any longer. It was, in the eyes of its critics and Crosland's critics, the future of socialism was, as Seaton and Cohen suggest, about removing socialism from the Labour Party altogether. The Labour Party, since its inception, had been a struggle between social democratic forces and those that were really allied to the status quo and allied to maintaining the system of power in Britain, albeit a slightly more benign one. From the 1950s onwards, and particularly intensely in the 70s and 80s, and now with the Labour Party and the Momentum movement and Jeremy Corbyn, there have been moments of acute confrontation within the party between social democratic and more conservative with a small c forces. Some might argue they're conservative with a big C, their critics. And it's fair to say that both Labour and Conservative parties are coalitions in their own right, coalitions of competing ideological forces that periodically these coalitions break down and then various chaotic things emerge as we are currently experiencing. The other enormously influential book of the early 60s that explained the nature of working class culture was The Uses of Literacy by Richard Hoggart, something I'm currently reading at the moment and hope to talk a bit more in depth about another time. This second explanation of the decay of Britain's working class, that they had been distracted by mass consumerism, was based on the observation that many of the rituals of working class life were disappearing. And this was in part due to television being a kind of a homogenized culture where TV shows from America or TV shows about non-working class lifestyles could be watched. And the insularity of working class community was slowly being broken down as TV provided a window onto a wider world. Seaton and Cohen write, paradoxically, working class culture was celebrated just as it seemed to be about to vanish. And obviously, programs such as Coronation Street, which began in the early 1960s, was evidence of that. Indeed, its condition was detailed by a generation of academics whose origins were working class, but all of whom had been upwardly mobile. To live a working class life, wrote Richard Hoggart, is to belong to an all-pervading culture, one in some ways as formalised and stylised as any that is attributed to the upper classes. And there's perhaps something to be said for that point of view. The working class life that he spoke of then was a working class life where class consciousness was very pronounced, i.e. knowing what social class one was in and the roles, the limitations of that class, the expectations, and how that class functions within society. And one could argue that traditionally Britain's upper classes have functioned in much the same way. The schools and boarding schools that upper class children are sent to really being training schools for class roles, places where you go to meet the right sort of person. So television was able to replace communal forms of leisure and association with a more isolated and standardised entertainment, or so it was thought. However, what emerges in Britain in the television era was a culture based far more around the intimacy of family life, that families benefited from television, and that television became something that was part of family life and an everyday family experience, until obviously later on, perhaps the 70s and the 1980s, where families start to have multiple televisions in their home and then cease to watch and experience TV together. The Pilkington Report, when it was produced, was really the product of two anxieties. The loss of the working class, they were being absorbed into the middle class, and the decay of working class culture, and the role of television in all of this. Raymond Williams wrote, the Marxist cultural critic Raymond Williams wrote, from 1956 to 1962 there was an intense development of ideas in the field of culture and communication, and by the time of the Pilkington Report this had reached the level of open and conventional politics. So these kinds of things were not simply cultural undercurrents, they were being articulated, as Williams put, at the level of open and conventional politics. People in the Houses of Commons were saying these things out loud. And the Pilkington Committee that created the Pilkington Report not only created an analysis of British television, but they also created an analysis of British society and culture in the television age, which was no small feat. Television would shape the nation and shape its morality and its mental attitudes, it was thought, and the values of society. But what television hasn't done is kill working class culture. Working class people haven't been assimilated into Britain's middle class, and working class culture and working class identity, just as middle class identity has changed, has transitioned, but is still a distinctive thing. It is a distinctive set of values and outlooks and beliefs. Working class people from the 1950s up until the 2010s have become progressively better off. And the way in which working class culture has transitioned has been really based around the development of affluence, mass affluence in British society. Attitudes, middle class and working class attitudes to things like sexual morality, private life, and individual pleasures and vices behind closed doors have fundamentally altered. But this is more to do with mass affluence than anything else. Seaton and Cohen write, the Pilkington Report depended on a sentimentalisation of an earlier golden age, just as Hoggart had before it. Indeed, it demonstrates the puritanical distaste for the effects of improved material conditions. Although its concern with the influence of television on social and cultural behaviour is important, the standards by which it judged the mass media were based on false premises about the nature of working class life. That working class life ceased to be authentic once there was a greater degree of material abundance, which is both misleading and kind of patronising by term. Anyway, I'm going to finish there. I hope you've enjoyed this, found it interesting, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. If you can donate in some small way to our Patreon fund, that would be great, and it keeps us going, and we can continue creating content for you. Anyway, thanks very much. I'll catch you on the next podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.